Hello, I'm Jude Scott, and today we're painting a stormy sky over the beach in watercolour. So if you'd like to try and paint a stormy sky, it's easy to follow steps. Join us and paint along. These are my three brushes that I like to use, and the first one I'll be using is the flat, very wide, it's a type of a hake brush. Where you can purchase these if you want to is at the end of the credits, which is underneath the video on YouTube. So just hit the more for more information. It's really important with this type of painting that your paper is wet, really, really wet, because the sky will be wet in wet. So you must paint the back and front 3 times. Yes, 3 times. The paper needs to be thoroughly wet before starting work. And if you've got dry patches, this technique will not work. The paper needs to be so wet that the first washes of pigment almost float across the surface, because the paper can dry super fast in low humidity and high heat, or if you're working inside with the air conditioner going. So it's really, really wet, and the paper is almost floppy, and you can see here that the shine, it's actually very reflective. It's super wet, and that's the same for the front and the back. So now I'm just mixing up my paints. I've got Cobalt Blue 290, and you need really strong, thick pigment for this. If your pigment's too watery, you won't get any depth of colour staying for long on your paper, because it will be diluted too much because we've got so much water on the paper. So make sure your paint is really strong. Now for the perfect grey, I'm using Mars Violet with Cobalt Blue and a little bit of raw Sienna, which is, this is really dry. So those 3 colours together will give you a terrific neutral grey. We're after a really neutral grey. So if you sort of brush that against the base of your palette, I do hope you're using a white palette, because you can't see the true colour on any other palette except white. You'll see that it should be a really neutral grey. So here I'm using the blues that I've mixed up previously for the sky, and just laying them in a random fashion. I don't actually have an image to work from for this, but I have been taking lots of photos of stormy skies, and I think if you want to really be able to paint anything, you need to probably study it for a while and really have a good look at clouds. And you'll see that there's always light over dark and dark over light. So here I'm doing the first layer of clouds. The paper is very wet, and this pigment looks quite dark, but it will fade a lot, because when you mix pigment up, the more water you add to it, the more diluted it becomes. So don't be afraid, don't be scared to put really strong pigment down. I think too the camera has picked this up and made it look a little bit darker than it actually is, but you will need very strong pigment, and you'll see later on in the painting how this depth of tone in the clouds will be quite a lot lighter. You can see also that the grey I've used is very neutral. If you've got too much warm in that, too much raw sienna, it will be brown. And if you've got too much blue in that, well, it'll be a blue cloud. So I want a very dark, neutral grey cloud. So I'm using Holbein paints, and these do tend to settle out a little bit, so you will get a little bit of blue on the edges of the cloud, which looks, I think, fantastic. And they are very, very true to the colour. So you can see now how the blue has settled down underneath that cloud, and it gives it, I think, quite a realistic look. So if you've got one of these hake brushes, or you don't really need one of these, you can just use, I use a 1-inch flat brush, which I'll use in a moment, and you can almost sculpt the clouds, the edges of the clouds, with a good 1-inch flat brush. But I want to put a little bit more pigment in here. You can see how quickly the last layer of very, very dark pigment has settled out and it's sort of flowed over the surface of the paper a little bit, and it's got really soft edges, which is what I want. Clouds are water, mist, thick dense mist in the sky, and if it gets dense enough it comes down as rain. So you do need soft edges on your clouds because they're made of water and they're misty, so you don't want any hard edges. So that's why I prefer to paint my clouds really on very wet in wet paper, front and back. So you can see now that this pigment is still moving over the surface of the paper from those clouds, and I'm just going to strengthen the blue sky just up above that dark cloud a little bit. I'm painting at the moment with this on a flat surface, but if you paint with it on an angle, probably about 30 degrees, just enough, the paint will start flowing down the paper. So the other thing you can do if you're painting on a flat surface is just pick your paper up and you can manipulate the paint to flow in the opposite direction. So if you hold it up, it'll flow down to the bottom of the paper. So if you do get any sharp lines or edges that you're not happy with, just pick your paper up and get that paint to flow where you want. Now this is my 1-inch flat brush, and it's fantastic for sculpting these clouds. And the paper is still very wet, the moisture's even coming through from the back of the paper. So you can see how I'll have to go over these edges a couple of times to lift out that pigment because it's still moving across the surface of the paper. So between all of these sculptural moves with your brush, rinse your brush clean and dry it thoroughly on a towel before you put it back on the paper. If you put a wet brush back into your cloud, you will end up with cauliflowers and it will ruin your work. So you need it just damp enough to lift off the pigment, but dry enough so that it doesn't add any more liquid to your clouds. And this is great fun. You know, if you can just tear up a whole lot of old paintings, paint on the back and try, 1/8 sheets if you want, or very, very small exercises in clouds. And just practice getting the edges soft, the tones correct, and where I've got those white wispy clouds going up to the sky, you do get a mix of textures in your clouds all within the one sky. So you can see already that cloud, the pigment has flowed back in to where I've already lifted it off. So just, you have to keep an eye on everything all at the same time and make sure that nothing dries too much before you're ready, and that you can use your dry brush to sculpt out and lift out some pigment off those clouds. See, this one's already, it's become a little bit too light, sorry, a bit too dark again, and I want that to be just a little bit lighter. Every time I lift my brush off, I'm drying it on the towel that's next to me. And you can also see how those clouds, which were almost, they looked almost black, they were so, the pigment was so strong, it's gone now to just a wonderful shade of very dark grey in the darkest areas, but it still has, all the clouds have soft edges. So you can make the clouds up, or you can work from an image. So now I want to lift off even more pigment, especially in that area there, that keeps coming back, that pigment keeps coming back. So I'm using a piece of kitchen paper, and I like Viva kitchen paper the best because it's lint free and you can almost use it like an eraser. But the thing you have to remember is wet it first and squeeze all the liquid out. If you use it dry, you'll get sharp edges on your clouds, but if you use it wet with no water coming out of it, you can just use it like an eraser and you can almost rub off the edges of those clouds and change the shape of them and make them go where you want to go. Okay, so I'm happy with those clouds, so now I'm going to start on the water at the beach. Here I'm using just a mix of Ultramarine, and I'm taking that straight across the far distant background. I've put in a land mass as well, and that's just with pretty much Ultramarine, and I've put some grey into that, what I've been using for the very dark clouds. So you can decide where you want your beach. I'm just making mine up. I've painted scenes like this before, and I love the look of, on a winter's day, the waves crashing against the rocks. So I have got quite a wet sea there, the ocean's quite wet, but I want to now push back into that with my 1-inch flat brush, and it's got synthetic bristles. So I don't use it for painting, but it's fabulous to lift off areas that need lightening, like the far edge of those rocks, and to lift out, you can lift out reflections on water with it as well. So if you don't have a 1-inch flat brush, I think they're wonderful. You might want to consider buying one. They're not expensive. Okay, so here I'm putting some sparkles across that water. So to put those sparkles in, I'm using almost dry paint, and I'm using my calligraphy brush almost on its edge, like horizontal to the paper, to drag that quickly across the surface of the water. Because that water is fairly close to the beach, I don't want too many sparkles because it will suggest still water. So I've just introduced with the 1-inch flat brush some moisture onto the paper, and now I'm going to put some more waves coming in close, or extend the waterline toward the shore. Okay, and another thing that these flat brushes are good for is lifting off, as I've said, and you can sculpt the waves. I want just a couple of small areas of the wave closest to the shore, just turning over a little bit, just about to crash. It's too wet to do anything with, I think, for a while, but I'll try it. And I can sculpt out some more white areas for the paper. So just tip 3, if you want some sparkles in the water, try using an almost dry pigment on your brush. Drag the brush very quickly over the surface of the paper, and it works best on rough paper with your brush held almost horizontal to the paper. So again, I'm putting in the beach, extending that water a little bit closer to the beach with a dry brush. So just moving that brush quickly so that I don't have a sharp edge between the sand and the water, because they will be bonded together. The water will be flowing over the sand, and you won't have, well, I won't have any definite sharp edges there. So a bit of dry brush will connect the two, especially if you go back to the water and just take a damp brush from the water to the sand and the sand back to the water. Now headland there has faded, as has the water, so I'm just darkening that up. It looks very, very dark here, but it won't be by the time it dries. And just under the crest of those waves, I just want a little bit of tone there, because where waves are very dense, where they've got the volume and they're crashing over the water, they are thicker and there's less light, so there's less light in the water. So you can see that all of that pigment that I put down previously has just disappeared, but it has put just enough depth into that water to make it look like it is the crest of a wave. Darken that up just a little more. Okay, I think to give it scale to the beach, it needs some small figures on the sand. So I'm just going to draw some figures. You can draw them almost like stick figures. But don't draw in legs and feet and hands. All you need is like a torso with two legs can become one, and just some small dark areas for the head. I'm going to turn my paper on the side and flick some pigment onto that sand, just so that there's a bit of variation. It looks like seaweed, shells, maybe there's a bit of rubble on the beach, and even a little bit of water, just to vary the tone and put a bit of texture there onto the sand. So again, some seaweed, maybe there's been things washed up on the beach, a few lines with a rigger brush. I didn't show this brush earlier, but it's one of my favourite brushes. I only have 4 that I use now, and they're wonderful. So I think that it's just about finished. Maybe we can put some birds in. I'll probably have to go over these when it's completely dry, because I'm using just white titanium for the birds, and it does fade, so very often you have to go over it 2 or 3 times to get the strength that you want. So now we'll have a look at the finished work. So here it is, it's dried. You can see the figures on the beach. The birds look a lot stronger now that they've been gone over. The clouds, I'm quite happy with the clouds, how the white goes up into the blue, and even though I put lots of pigment there to start with, it has faded. So thanks very much for watching, and if you've enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will make some more videos. Happy painting!